Welcome to Sleepover with Yuri. If you've ever been categorized as a minority, whether for being an immigrant or LGBTQ or a person of color, well, guess what? You are in a majority on my show. As Sleepover with Yuri is a show that celebrates diversity, promotes equality, raises awareness, and spreads love. As Sleepover with Yuri is a show that empowers minorities. Here on my show, we talk about things that are often not talked about. We talk about things that are stigmatized and tabooed. Close to 800,000 people die by suicide every year. Furthermore, for each suicide, there are more than 20 suicide attempts. Suicide and suicide attempts have a ripple effect that impacts on families, friends, colleagues, communities, and societies. Suicides are preventable. Much can be done to prevent suicide at individual, community, and national levels. Suicides are especially popular among LGBTQ people and LGBTQ community. 40% of all suicides are committed by LGBTQ people. During the pandemic, the numbers of cases are going high and rising. On December 27 in 2020, last year, I lost a very dear friend of mine who committed suicide by jumping out of the window. That was the saddest experience I've ever had in my life. Today, on my show, I would like to raise awareness. I would like to contribute in suicide prevention by raising awareness and talking about it. With my next guest, a friend of mine who tried to commit suicide in the past himself and lost his family member to it. Victor.
Hey Yuri, thanks
Hi,
for having me.
Victor. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate your courage and coming out tonight and talking about this really heavy
Yeah.
subject that I feel we don't talk about enough. And when I personally experienced it, I didn't know how to live with it or understand it or cope with it because I don't think that we have tools for it as we never really educate people about it
Yeah.
or don't even talk enough about it.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for being very supportive and helping me when I was going through it, when I was going through grief the first week, because I really appreciated that you took your time and reached out to me and offered your support and your time to just listen and share your experience with me. It was really helpful.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Before anything, I love your comfy outfit. Is that
It's
what you
super
normally wear
comfy.
at home,
No, I
or?
don't wear anything in bed, but I can sit here like naked.
I don't know. I've mentioned it so many times, but I'll keep bringing it up. Every single guest, 99% of my guests told me that they sleep naked, so I'm not even surprised,
Yeah.
especially with you.
Right,
I'm actually
exactly.
having my ass. But thanks for putting some clothes on today and coming
I
out.
feel very
And
comfy.
love your ink a lot.
Thank you.
How many tattoos do you have?
I don't actually keep count. It's probably about 25, I think.
25.
Yeah, I started when I was 15.
Wow.
But I have so many covered under newer ones, so that's how it's hard for me to keep count of them.
Is there history behind it, or why you keep doing
I
this?
mean, the ones on my arms were all kind of inspired by Day of the Dead. This is actually a portrait of my sister who committed suicide.
Oh, let me see. Mm.
And I think, I lived in Mexico as part of my undergrad Spanish degree. And I found that idea of Day of the Dead very interesting because death there is not really something that's like, it's not as heavy. For example, British people are very repressive about emotional stuff, so we really don't talk about death very much. Whereas in Mexico, it's something that is celebrated every year. You go to the grave of the people who've passed away and you kind of celebrate and leave offerings for them and stuff. And for somebody who's lost somebody, that just sat better with me. It's not an act of forgetting when somebody passes away. It's much more getting together every year and kind of remembering all the fun stuff and all the good memories as opposed to kind of trying to push it away and move on from it. So that kind of inspired a lot of the Mexican stuff, the Day of the Dead stuff.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that. It's very relevant to what we're
Yeah,
talking about today. And this is a really good point that you brought up right away about maybe not necessarily celebrating death, but being aware of that
yeah,
and accept it as part of life,
right,
and
exactly, and
not
making
just,
it less taboo.
yeah, because I agree. For me, it's something that my family, my friends would never talk about either. So when it happened, I lost it. I didn't know how to react and what to do. Versus to if you talk about it and know that it's going to come at some point or another,
Yeah,
and there are different ways of forms of death, and suicide is one of the forms of death that's been around for
right.
centuries. Then it gets easier. And for me, one of my biggest coping mechanisms and tools that helped me um, snap out and get out of the grief that I was experiencing on a deep level the first week of when my friend committed suicide was talking to people and hearing people who experienced it.
Right.
And because you guys, including you, laid it out to me as it's norm, it's fine, it's part of life. You just have to live through it and experience it. And that's something that really helped me, just talking about it and not sitting in my emotions and feelings at home alone, but constantly talking about
I
it.
mean, I think the message I always want to give, and I went through this with a friend about 6 months ago whose older brother died of suicide, and he had a wife and kids, and it was super sad. Um, the message that I always want to give is that it's very easy for you to want to blame yourself and think about things that you said or didn't say that you wish you had said, or things that you wish you had done, or things that you wish you hadn't done. Um, but from my experience, when I was feeling really suicidal, there was nothing that anybody could have said to have changed my mind. There really wasn't. You know, my family were the thing that kept me going as long as I did. But I was very much made up in my mind that I didn't want to be here anymore. And I think that it's kind of like a fool's errand to try and figure out what you could have done to have changed that person's decision. Because a lot of the time, the decision is very, very impulsive. You know, when my sister died, it hadn't been her first attempt. You know, she was very bipolar and she had been sick for a very, very long time. But it was very, very impulsive. You know, her daughter had just left for school, and by the time her boyfriend got home, my sister had already done it. You know, it was something that was very spur of the moment. And I think for him, like, he really wanted to try and figure out what he could have done differently that could have changed things. But I think with my sister, particularly, with that not being her first attempt, there wasn't anything that was going to stop her. She was so madly in love with her daughter, but it was still possible for her to feel that all of us would be better off without her. You know, that was the frame of mind that she was in.
Did you talk about that before? Ryan? How do you know
I
that that's the
mean,
frame of mind that she had?
when my sister was 8 years older than me and my brother, and when her bipolar started to manifest, we were probably she was about 16, so we were about 8 or 9. And my mum really tried to shield us from it as much as possible. So, you know, my sister was very heavily bipolar. She would have 6 months of the year where she would be so depressed that she would be hospitalized. She would not really leave her bed. She would be very, very, very depressed. And then the other 6 months of the year when she'd be going through manic episodes, she would disappear for months at a time. She would come back with a boyfriend who just got out of jail for armed robbery. She'd be doing crazy drugs. Like, it was very unpredictable and very, very difficult for us as kids. So my mum really protected us from that. And I think that I didn't realize how many suicide attempts my sister had had until she actually succeeded with it. And then then my mum was able to open up a little bit more about what she'd been putting up with for such a long time. Because, you know, my mum and my sister were best friends, but my mum was almost like a primary caretaker as well, and that she had gone through this so many times with my sister, and she really kind of bore the brunt of all of that very much alone.
Victor, you mentioned something that really got stuck with me right away. You said that your sister's mindset was that the world would be better off without her, even though she loved her daughter. She wanted to be here for her daughter.
Yeah.
She loved her. You know, there were people she loved and that brought joy into her life. However, she still felt that she would be better. The world would be better off without her. Is that something she mentioned? How do you know that that's what's her
Yeah, I
mindset?
mean, she during her manic episodes, especially as my niece, her daughter was 9 when my sister passed, and in the last couple of years before my sister passed away, when she would have manic episodes, she would be having affairs. She would be doing things that were really super reckless, and when she would crash and go back into the depression, it would really hit her that she was not being a good parent. That's what she really obsessed over, that she wasn't being like a consistent parent to my daughter, that she was putting my niece's father through hell. And, you know, when she passed away, she was in one of those modes of just being so depressed and so anxious and so full of regret for things that she had done. And, when you're manic, you really don't appreciate the kind of consequences of what you're doing. You act in very reckless ways. You spend lots of money, you have unprotected sex, you do all kinds of things that are very reckless. And it's only when you kind of crash from that that it all hits you what you've done. And with my sister, it was just this constant feeling of like, I'm not being a good parent. As much as I love my daughter, the way that I act and the way I behave is really detrimental to her happiness. So I think that was very much what was going on in her mind.
Mm. And very sorry to hear that, by the way. Losing a friend was sad. I can't even imagine what it feels like losing a sibling or someone you love, a partner to this. I can imagine, but it's on a deeper level, and I just feel so sorry for people who were affected by it. Victor, I know that you mentioned that you had suicide attempts in the past yourself,
Yeah.
and which I'm sure helps you understand the mindset of someone who does that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you mind opening up about it and just sharing
Yeah, of course.
what led you to that
Yeah.
state of mind or mood? How would you even describe that?
So I had always experienced a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety. And the first suicide attempt I had been living in Mexico for a year. I was coming back to school for the final year of my degree, and the relationship that I'd been in for the last 3 years was kind of coming apart. And I come back to London. My ex-boyfriend, was in New York at the time, and kind of hit me that I had been, you know, investing so much in this relationship that really wasn't very healthy or working, and had really taken my eye off my studies. And I'm very much a perfectionist, and I always had really good grades. So going into my final year of college, I was super, super stressed about getting the absolute best grade. And that anxiety started to mount. And what I would do is I would try to medicate that with alcohol and drugs. And the 3 suicide attempts I had over 6 or 7 years all followed exactly the same pattern of getting very anxious, getting very depressed, self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, and the suicidal feeling kind of coming from that, of feeling that I couldn't stop taking drugs, couldn't stop drinking. I mean, the first suicide attempt, I was not going to school. I was like waiting for my roommate to get out of bed in the morning, going to a liquor store, buying vodka, rotating around the different liquor stores in the neighborhood so that I wouldn't get seen at the same place too many times. And I would just stay in bed drinking all day. And this friend of mine in the US had sent me like a care package, and it had 40 Xanax in it. And I literally just swallowed the whole bottle while I was drunk and really didn't think much about it. So that was the first attempt. And, I was
So it's over a relationship.
It was like a relationship ending and then self-medicating through that. And the suicidal part really came from feeling that I couldn't stop drinking or couldn't stop doing drugs. And obviously, I was in the hospital, in an ICU at first, and then in a psych ward, because for suicide attempts, they have to make sure you're okay. And it was about 2 weeks after that, when I came out, that my sister, had her suicide. And so I was very much in that mindset of, was this my fault? If I hadn't attempted this, would she have been so pushed to do it? Because I think for me, there was this feeling after she committed suicide of like, well, now I can never do it. You can't have 2 of these in the same family. That would be like horrible. So there was that feeling of like, did I push her towards this, of feeling like, oh God, Victor's going to get there first if I don't do it now. But like I said, you can't fall into that trap of trying to think that you're behaviors and your words, your actions could have influenced this other person.
But Victor, what ran through your mind at that time when you did you know that by swallowing that bottle were you expect was that an attempt to actually
I
die?
think that attempt I was very much
You were
expecting to
ready
die. Yeah.
to go. And what ran through your mind? And did you think
I
about
mean, I think
your
I was so
loved ones
drunk.
or anyone at the
I think
time?
I was so drunk at that time that it was just like so disinhibited. Like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to go to sleep straight away. I'm not going to think about any of this stuff. I don't think my family came to my mind. Like, there was no writing notes or like setting things out and trying to like leave a message behind for people.
You
It
were
was
not trying
really
to hurt
just
nobody or give a
no.
message to
I don't
anybody.
think that
Just
even came into my mind. I really think in that moment it was so impulsive that it was just like I want to do this
impulsive.
now. Yeah, you know, more recently, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with having borderline personality disorder, and suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts are very, very common in that. About I think 10% of all people with BPD die of suicide, and the reason is when you have BPD, you have very, very intense emotional reactions to things, both positive and negative. And especially around the end of relationships, I would always get very, very kind of depressed, very anxious. I mean, a big part about BPD is that you really find rejection and abandonment very, very, very painful, usually because of something that happened in your childhood. With me, it was my dad leaving, had a very, very difficult relationship with him. He was very abusive. But that feeling carried on throughout my life of that fear of abandonment. And when relationships would end, it was that feeling of like the message that I got from my dad of not being, worthy of love, not being worthy of attention, that I was never going to amount to anything. That message that I'd kind of internalized from him, that would come out, and that would lead me to doing drugs a lot of the time. And the suicidal feelings for me would then stem from the drug and alcohol use more, because I just felt like I couldn't stop. The fact that I was able to be suicidal after my sister had died that way really speaks volumes to it, in that knowing what had happened to my family, knowing what we had gone through as a family, and still feeling that desire to really be able to go through with it was very, very intense. I the last suicide attempt, it was a very, very heavy overdose. Um, and I really didn't want to wake up. Like, I really was determined, that I couldn't, I had tried to stop using drugs so many times, and I was just kind of picking up any drugs on the street to kind of get myself through the come down from the drug that I was doing. And it was just hopeless, very messy. I had no job. I was just in a very, very bad place. And there was that feeling of like, I love my family so much, but I really can't take this suffering anymore. I really can't. And, once I came to in the ICU, the drugs were out of my system by the time I was conscious. The drug that I was taking is out of your system very fast. And there was that feeling of relief of like, thank God, like it took this awful gesture, but I've got to that point where the drugs are out of my system. I feel, rational again. I'm able to look at things and be like, glad that I survived. And, that was the day that I got sober. It's 2 years almost to the day. My anniversary was last Friday. You can't get a better kind of motivation to get sober than that, because for me, I know that it really is life or death. Like, if I go back to using, that feeling of like not being able to stop will get to that feeling of like, well, I'm not worth staying alive. It's just not, I don't want to live like this. So getting sober, getting my diagnosis, being able to work with a therapist on addressing the way that I felt about myself, addressing this very kind of negative self-construction that I had, and building myself up again. I needed all of that, but until I was diagnosed, I really didn't know what the problem was with myself. And before I got sober, there was just that barrier to me actually doing proper work on myself, because it was easier just to get high, to not have to think or feel anything. But I think suicide can come from so many different places. It can be really a structural, cultural thing. You look at some of the suicides in Asian countries where people are just overworked, they put massive pressure on themselves at their jobs, and they get to that point where they just feel like they're going to break. Or in India recently, there was a lot of suicides among farmers because they're not getting paid the amount that they need to get paid for their crops. Their businesses, they have no money. They're going to go out of business. They're not able to feed their families. That desperation, that's what fuels suicide. That feeling of like, I'm not able to provide for the people that I love. I'm not going to be able to survive. Why would I stay alive to suffer like this? I think that's where that feeling comes from a lot of the time.
Thank you for everything you just said. It was so therapeutic for me, and it honestly medicated me, um, you know, to process what, the experience that I had losing a friend. As everything you said was just, it just helped me make so much sense, because when it happened, I kept telling my friends that I just can't understand the nature behind it and why. I just can't understand it. And just hearing what you just had to say really explained a lot, and shed a lot of light on it, and gave me a lot of answers. So I want to thank you for that. So having a conversation with you, like a very, it feels so casual, even though we're talking about some really heavy stuff right
Right.
now. But it just feels so normal, and I wish it's something that if I was brought up or raised having those conversations with my parents
Yeah.
or at school, it would be a lot easier to understand why people do that. And even
Yeah.
like I said today, like, and I don't want to put too much, um, emphasis on this, or put you on a pedestal, but I do want to do that, because even just listening to you, what you've gone through and your experiences and how you explain it helps me a lot. It's medicating me and my loss and my grief so much, just to understand the nature behind it, why people do that, and it really helps to it explains. So I applaud you for that, and I'm sure that everything that you have to say that would help a lot of people out there. Victor, so you mentioned that you study therapy, and at this point you're at the point of your life where you feel like you can help people who experiencing that or might experience that.
Yeah.
What would your advice be, or what's the best way to help someone who is going through a loss of a friend, a family member, partner who committed suicide? How should we treat um, those people who are victims
Right.
of that as well?
I mean, I think, everybody handles grief differently. And this is a particular type of grief in that the person that passed away did it of their own volition. They did it by choice. And like I said before, I think it's a very natural instinct for the person who's been left behind to try to figure out what they did wrong, the things that they could have said differently, all the things that they could have done to stop that person from doing it. And I think a really fundamental message to get through to people is that, unfortunately, there was very little that you could have done to have changed this person's mind, whether it was a very impulsive decision that they took or whether it was something that was planned for a really long time. When you're suicidal, you become very, very insular. You really are thinking only of your own suffering. And the suicide itself is like this light at the end of the tunnel that you're looking through. And it's very easy to get stuck in this kind of trap of feeling that, your world just gets very, very small. When I was really at the end of my last kind of suicidal feeling, I had very little in my life in terms of friends. I really wasn't communicating with people. I was home alone, doing drugs, sleeping as much as possible all the time. And, when you're in that mindset, you really just want an end to your suffering more than anything. And there was nothing that anybody could have said to me at that point, I think, to have changed my mind. Like, I just, wanted out. And I think for the person who's left behind, and I think for us as a society as a whole, we tend to brand the person that did this as very selfish or very weak. For me, I never really felt that with my sister. One thing I didn't grow up in a religious family, so there wasn't that feeling of like, oh my God, my sister's burning in hell for this. Like, there was just that feeling of like, I've lost somebody that I really, really love. But it was a different kind of grief than if she had been a really happy person that had been in a car crash. Somebody who had lost a life that she really wanted to hang on to. This was somebody who was suffering so fundamentally for so many years of her life. And even with all of the things that made her so happy, she still felt that she couldn't carry on anymore. And, I had to try to put myself in her shoes and understand that feeling and, not take it personally. It's not about the people that have been left behind. In the mind of the person who's very suicidal, it's really just about them. It's about an end to feeling this horrible, horrible way.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I can't thank you enough for your input. I did not expect to hear what I heard today from you. You said a lot in all the things that I needed to hear, and I'm just really grateful for having you over tonight. I feel like the universe is working, and I always say this about my show, not to but I feel like the universe is giving me the right guest and the right time, and using me as a tool to deliver the message to the crowds. Victor, the last thing that I want to ask you to do before we go to sleep, because it's late, I would like you to say something to the people out there, if they're watching, who consider committing suicide or suicidal right now, who who are struggling. If there is anything you can say to them to help them not do it, what would you say?
I think I would say that I understand exactly how you're feeling and how desperate it can be. But I like to think of myself as proof that once you are able to escape that feeling, there's a whole other life on the other side that can be really beautiful and really enjoyable. And you are going to leave behind a lot of pain and a lot of hurt people. It's very, when you're suicidal, I know that you can think only of yourself and kind of escaping that feeling of pain. But if you're able to consider the other people around you and to think about what you'll be leaving behind, you have to try and hang on to that as much as possible. I think that would be my message.
Thank you, Victor. All right, that's well. On that beautiful note, just want to thank you again for coming over tonight and having a sleepover.
Thank you for having me.
And you're such a beautiful person, and I'm happy you're alive, and you're happy that sober. You're with us, and I hope that you have a lot more beautiful years of life to live, and
Me too.
hopefully never ever go back to the thinking that you had in the past when you tried to commit suicide. I love you, Victor.
Love you
and,
too.
have a good night, and I love you guys. Have a good night, everyone. It was a sleepover with Yuri. Mwah.